In a world where it's Kendrick this or Drake that, let me show you that there's actually something else that you can put blind faith into, and that's Crow Country. As someone whose favorite Resident Evil is the first game, and I just generally love the survival horror genre, Crow Country is a near-perfect modernization of the classic genre with those same old-school looks. So, to the uninitiated, in the game you'll be trying to investigate what happened to the owner of an abandoned theme park. Edward Crow is the catalyst of the journey, but along the way you'll meet new faces, solve clever puzzles, and of course face deadly horrors. As Mara, you'll make your way to the place that once brought many families joy akin to a Disneyland park, and you'll soon find it decrepit and run down. Immediately, the myriad of albeit faded colors juxtaposed against the ever-growing sense of dread instilled in the dark hallways. Upon entering very differently themed areas, you'll realize that although it's only one location the game takes place in, there's a lot of variety in what you can see. Speaking of seeing, the game even from a mechanical standpoint isn't messing around. So just speaking on moving around the park, you've got two tools at your disposal. First off, a flashlight that is really useful, and while there's no battery or limit to anything like that, you'll always want to switch it on and off depending on the visibility of the room you're in. And where I think the devs really did a great job is the camera for the game. So it's pretty high above our little detective as she moves around, but you do have full 360-degree rotation. So while you do have complete control of where you can look around, unlike fixed camera angles, the game still keeps things eerily tense by not allowing you to see everything even in the room you're in, which really plays in well with the sound design when sometimes you can hear enemies off in the distance, but you can't always see them. So whether you're in an arcade room, a replica haunted mansion, or even a windy and rainy maze, the sense of atmosphere is always on point visually. Compounding with that is the game's sound design, which can be described with no other word than perfect. Primarily, you'll notice as you move from location to location, you'll generally be treated to a different track that plays. Sometimes hokey-pokey, high-energy kids' songs play as a reminder of what the park was before the horror, and other times the track at hand is a perfect build-up of creepiness. Think of it like the Halloween theme playing before you ever actually see Michael Myers. And I present to you this scene here. The other sound effects of the game don't skimp out either. While there really isn't much voice acting, it's truly not missed here due to how immersive the other effects are. Whether it's the slow slink of an enemy, or even how heavy they sound as they fall to the ground, you'll feel completely enthralled by every combat encounter, or how satisfying every gunshot is due to the screen shake and the firing sound hitting just right. Another small detail I love are the sounds of sickness as you talk to someone who is, well, sick. And that brings me up to the one final bit before we talk about the overall gameplay loop, and that's the story itself. Whether you're finding notes around the world or you're talking to characters, there's a lot of mysteries to uncover. While I won't spoil anything, I'd like to say that I generally enjoyed reading newspaper articles and police reports from the past. Even the tutorials for the game are written in-game as rules for the park guests, so props for that being diegetic and all within world. One minor complaint I did have was that you can't view these notes on the fly from your inventory. You actually have to go to the safe room to view all the notes that you found, as well as these tutorial things, and sometimes these even hold potential clues or solutions to solve puzzles. So that can be a bit annoying, I can't lie. This is one of those bits of gameplay that genuinely feels archaic when the rest of the game presents itself gracefully aged forward. Now, if we're actually talking to characters, there actually is a neat little bit of story presentation and player agency within the dialogue with characters as well. Every once in a while you'll run across a character that may need like a med kit or an antidote to a poison in order to seemingly keep them alive. And while I always have these items on hand, I'm curious to know if any characters in the game can actually die in these instances due to you being unprepared, or if this is simply something in order to progress the main story along, you had to do at all times. Regardless though, in that way, the game reminds me a lot of Dark Souls, or Souls-like games in the sense that as you're moving around these environments, some of these characters are moving autonomously of your own story, and while you can expand and exhaust all of their dialogue options for as much information as possible, every once in a while they may need a little something from you, or they may give you hints the other way around. And from a story standpoint, I'll leave it at that. I think it's really interesting how the game handles itself. But really, for this last little bit of the video, I want to settle in on two things: the puzzles as well as the actual combat itself. I want to start with the combat because I feel like I've already highlighted a lot of why it feels so good, whether it be the sound designs of the enemies feeling both menacing and foreboding, while also feeling satisfying to hit them at the same time. But visually speaking was another point that I actually really enjoyed. So first off, there's a good bit of enemy variety based off of what's shown. You've got some giant skeletons, little sludge balls, and a few other more humanoid-styled enemies. There's more, but I'll leave it at that. But at a base level, while they do visually look very different and all fit thematically, both whether it be within the park or within the type of enemies you've been facing up till this point, what really made the difference to me was how some of these enemies felt to encounter. For instance, some of the humanoid enemies would shamble and move slowly, and then once they've got their sights on you and they lock on, they move a little more quickly with a little bit more haste towards you. Some of these smaller, more sludgy looking creatures are always at a constant slow pace, but they're always kind of moving obstacles if you get near them. And then of course you've got those creepy ass giant skeletons, which were really the ones that made me notice this. Sometimes I notice that the enemies don't detect you very easily, while for sure if you've got multiple enemies coming at you at once, maybe even cornering you, that's when you need to make combat. But this game makes it very easy to be able to run around and kind of juke out these enemies, especially in wider areas. And there's a reason for that I'll get into in just a minute, which I think does work, but I think it can be a slight failure at times. But for the sake of this argument, let's say you actually get cornered and you actually have to have combat. So what do you have at your disposal? You've got weapons. So you've got a pistol, you've got a shotgun, and something else I won't even spoil. The items in this game feel good enough, but what really interests me is the way that you aim in this game. So you have full stick control. I definitely recommend playing this game with a controller. The game's going to warn you to do that yourself. And with your stick, once you start aiming, you're going to be able to start moving around, and you'll see, of course, the laser sight moving around. It helps you easily detect enemies. And just like the Resident Evil games that have you do the same thing, I believe 4 and 5 initially had you doing this. It always adds to an analog nature, which really is immersive in feeling, even if you don't feel like you're the little girl on the screen. But it can add to the chaos of these equations. So as these enemies are running at you or very quickly cornering you and you have to make an opening to run away, you'll realize that you have to make quick decisions. Of course, being closer to enemies does more damage, and shooting them in the head will take them out more quickly. But at the same time, that weapon sway is always kind of working against you at the same time, because there is a slight sway to how you're aiming. One thing I will say though is, I don't know if this was just, I'm just that good at aiming, or if it was the game itself, but it did seem like there was a light bias of the aiming itself to where the gun did generally stay near the target, so you only had to fight it a little bit and not, it's going to take it all the way off the screen for you. So in that way, it was both intuitive and challenging at the same time. But okay, I mentioned that the game makes it very obvious that a lot of these equations, a lot of these scenarios, you're going to want to run from enemies when you can. The reason for that is this. As you're progressing throughout the game, solving more puzzles and doing everything you need to do, the environments become layered and layered with higher difficulty enemies and, quite frankly, just more numbers. So it behooves you earlier in the game, or whenever you can, to take out as many enemies as possible. Because, as they start adding more and more to these rooms, it won't be as hectic. And while this is a really good idea and concept, it works great. I'm not even saying there's a but to this. Every once in a while I notice with single enemies, especially like those bigger ones that seem like they would be a little bit more of a threat, I kind of noticed that, hey, listen, I think this guy should be able to see me a little easier and be a little bit more like a mini boss or something I should be focusing on in these scenarios. Kind of like in Doom Eternal, anytime you see a marauder, you're going to realize you want to take out one of those before you deal with pretty much any other demon in the vicinity. But when running around these environments, you better make sure you have your flashlight on, because there's a myriad of different traps around the world that could lead to your downfall. Whether it be poisonous traps, bear traps that you can actually use to your advantage by making enemies step into, or even hanging ceiling traps that tend to, for whatever reason, in my opinion, my brain allowed me to forget that they were there even if I saw them. It was kind of like, hey, I realized that this is in the foreground and I'm in the background, and then I'd keep walking under them and get hurt. So that's just on me, I guess. Regardless though, I really enjoy that every aspect of the park feels like a threat, especially as these new traps are added to certain rooms that you're in, and all of the little items and nooks and crannies that you can find for combat and healing, and of course the actual combat itself is quite satisfying. One little note I will have to say that I feel like should be something that is fixed for the game. This would take my supposed 10 rating down to like a 9.5. This was genuinely one of my biggest problems with the game. But it ended up being a non-issue because the game isn't really asking for that precision like I thought. Was that there seemingly isn't a way to reload a save in this game without going back to the main menu. So while there are, save screens and different, save slots in the game for different points in the game, you have to go back to the menu to do so, and you can't do it from the in-game menu, which is fine, but it's just an extra loading screen. No big deal, but if you fuck up a combat encounter and want to save scum that bitch, then that's how you can do it. But finally, the last thing I really wanted to talk about were the puzzles for the game. I wanted to say that the game just is very smart. I'm not going to give proper examples for this because I feel like a lot of these puzzles should be experienced on their own. But sometimes the game requires you to do math, and it gives very helpful hints, and there is a hint system just in general within the game. But the biggest difference between, say, Crow Country and my favorite Resident Evil is that this isn't a game where the inventory in and of itself is its own puzzle. So while there is an inventory and there are inventory slots, you don't really need to worry about, maneuvering certain items in the inventory or only holding certain items or storing certain items at, some place. That's really not an issue here. And as long as you have the item you need and you pick the correct item from your inventory, sometimes it'll ask you, hey, how do you want to interact with this? And if you pick the wrong item, you can't progress. But let's say you try to put, a giant gemstone in place of where a valve should go. That's not going to work. You need an actual valve to turn whatever it is on or off. So there is still item puzzles within the game, but more importantly, there's so many just little varied puzzles that ask a lot of different things, whether it be the positioning of the player, solving the correct answers to questions, quiz-styled questions. I think it's really interesting, and sometimes they even ask it from the perspective of 1990s and not 2024, which is really, really cool. A great touch. With all that being said, though, I want to leave a lot of the puzzles and the story for the game as much of a mystery as possible, but I feel like I've highlighted enough of that. The location, Crow Country, is an amazing setting. I love this a lot. And while, I'll be honest, I don't think Mara was, the craziest character at all, she's just plain enough to be a great horror protagonist, and somehow, someway, I would love to see maybe not Crow Country, but some crazy new setting for the next one, if that's at all possible. And even if that's not something that ever happens, I'm definitely going to be following the developers a lot more closely, because there's a lot to love about this and this atmosphere of Crow Country. That being said, I'm kind of done giving formal scores for my games anymore. I never did number scores, but I always did either buy it now, wait for a sale, or, really don't buy it. And while I like that concept, I really feel like the best way to go about it, and this is 100% stolen from SkillUp, because I think this is just the way that I can get around this easiest. I don't have to think about it as much. It's just, hey, did I like the game or did I not? And while I would definitely give this game a really, really, really high rating, I have to just say, I recommend Crow Country. It's a great game that's going to keep you enthralled the whole time with the ever so minor bits of pushback here and there. It's a near-perfect game that runs phenomenally on the Steam Deck, PC, Xbox, PlayStation, you know the drill. And if you can play the game, I definitely recommend that. And with that being said, consider subscribing, consider following my Twitter account, @fallinghurts1, and letting me know if I got it right or if I got it wrong. Regardless, thanks for watching. Goodbye.